response techniques. We are going to be going over incident response techniques and how the Cisco security portfolio fits into those techniques. The basic question that we're going to be answering in today's session is, what do my customers do all day, and how can we help them do that? And the idea is that if we can speak more naturally to our customers and speak more natively and understand their concerns and express how the Cisco security portfolio ties into those challenges and helps them overcome daily problems that they're having, obviously that they are going to be more able to see and to understand how it is that our products are able to make them more efficient and make their teams more efficient, and obviously that leads to the conclusion that we all want. At the end of this session, you're going to be able to understand what are the biggest challenges faced by incident responders and what steps responders take to overcome each of those challenges, and be able to explain, like I said, how Cisco products can help them overcome these specific challenges. As we go through this agenda today, please do put your questions into the Q&A functionality of WebEx. We've got a team of great advanced threat solutions staff looking over those questions, ready to answer them for you. So please do make use of that if you have any specific questions about anything that I'm saying. We're going to talk about why do we even do incident response? What is incident response for, essentially? We're going to describe some basic workflows that are used to perform incident response. What are the primary challenges that are repeatedly faced in the course of an incident response? We're going to talk about the tools that Cisco offers that factor into incident response strategies, go through some user cases, and I'm going to show you some additional resources that are available for further learning. So first up, why do we need to respond to incidents? Isn't our job preventing incidents? Isn't our job as a security practitioner or as a security software provider supposed to be to prevent these incidents from happening? Yes, it is. But it's been 30, 40 years of the security industry, and incidents still happen for primarily one reason. No one of these kinds of strategies is 100% effective because of the different kinds of attacks that exist. And it's simple as this diagram shows. You have defense in depth. You have all these different layers of defense around the target. And every single one of them has their limitations. An email security appliance is not going to see what goes over the web. A web security appliance might not see what goes over instant messaging. Your endpoint isn't going to see attacks against the network infrastructure, and so on. But at each layer, good files are set to make it through. Right? We have whitelisted files or files that are known to be benign. Those get passed through by design, so that's great. We have malicious files get passed through until they reach a layer that detects them, and then those get blocked, and that's great. But good files and known threats are both known. Unknown threats typically are passed through to the next system because most threats, most files are going to be unknown. It's simple math, really. Most files, every time you alter an Excel document, every time you add something to the PowerPoint slide you're working on, that's a change to the file. Most files are going to be unknown, and we can't block unknown files or nobody would ever get anything done. So incident response is needed because occasionally one of those unknown files is in fact a threat. That's just the nature of the game. And then you have your target infected and nobody's happy, and you have an incident to which somebody has to respond. Now, hopefully everyone is familiar with AMP's idea of retrospective security, which is where if we find out later that something got let through but it was a threat, we can still go back and say, hey, that file you asked me about last week, turns out it's a threat, and you should now quarantine that. So we do that, and this is a chart showing how often we do that. In the first 3 quarters of calendar year 2018, 7.5% of all AMP detections were retrospective. Now, what that means is that 92.5% of the time we caught it at the time, and that's great. That is a really good record, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, there are so many threats that 7.5% that are caught, you know, an hour later, 2 hours later, a week later, that's still a significant amount, and we have to help our customers address those. So here's an example of why something might get passed through. There's a malware called Adwind. that uses malformed Excel template files that have dynamic data exchange enabled. So the resulting pop-up when you have to access a DDE object, this pop-up you see on the screen, the user has to click yes. And of course, users click yes because a user is basically just a meat robot that clicks yes on things, right? So we're going to get people who are infected. However, in ThreatGrid, if the playbook that clicks yes on these things was not selected, this would just sit there and not do anything malicious, and it would get passed through to the next layer, and we would end up detecting it later via retrospection. And when that happens, what do we have? We have an incident. Somebody is going to have to respond to that. Here's a somewhat more complex example, VPN filter. VPN filter has multiple command and control stages with backups. So just to go through it quickly, stage 1 here connects to PhotoBucket. And if it can't connect to PhotoBucket for any reason, it connects to knowall.com. Either one, it gets an image and extracts some instructions from the embedded EXIF data. That those instructions are the location of stage 2. If both of those fail, if it can't get to PhotoBucket or to knowall, it just opens the listener and sits and waits for instructions about where is stage 2 located. When it goes to stage 2, it downloads a new piece of malware. That piece of malware checks for CNC, installs some plugins, and so on. Now, maybe when this thing is being analyzed, the image isn't on PhotoBucket yet because the attacker hasn't put it there yet. Maybe when it's being analyzed, both PhotoBucket and to knowall aren't able to be reached for some reason because you've got in air gap mode, and so it's not going to do anything else at that time. Another interesting thing is that with these multi-stage types of malware, if you block PhotoBucket because nobody legitimate is using PhotoBucket in your network, your attacker is going to know that PhotoBucket has been blocked. And one, knows that his malware is just going to go to knowall.com anyways and still get the instructions, but two, knows that you're aware that something is going on. So you've revealed your hand a bit. That's going to be important later on. So these are two examples of why our excellent protection might not work in specific cases until a little bit later, and why we might have an incident to respond to, why security alerts even happen. Incident response workflows. Incident response is a thing that has been happening for a while, and some workflows have been formalized around this. But primarily, we've got 3 parts of an incident response capability. Okay, you've got your people. The people can have formal training in incident response. Incident response is a discipline now that can be taught. They've got on-the-job experience. If some vendor-specific training that might be worked in as they, take courses to learn how to use a Cisco technology or third-party technologies. They've got internal training. How does our team do incident response? What are our internal playbooks at your customer location? And knowledge of that local customer environment as well. These are our primary assets. These are our primary risks. This is the way our network is segmented and all of that. Then we've got the technology part. What is the data on the endpoint? How do we do our network monitoring? From where do we get our threat intelligence? How do we do our incident detection? What technologies do we have set up to do forensics? Do we have a red lab in which we can do malware research? All of those kinds of things. And then the third one is the process. So this is part of what I was talking about internal training under people, and it also plays into technology. What technology do we have available? But process is the steps. How do we use these things? What do we do to prepare? What do we do to detect an incident? How do we do containment of active infections? How do we do eradication and recovery? And what are the lessons that we have learned? And how do we put those lessons to work for protecting us against future incidents of this kind? So let's talk about that process a little bit more. This process diagram here starts at preparation, where you deploy your detections, you deploy your preventions, and you set up the steps. What is going to be taken, like what are our playbooks? If this happens, we do, if X happens, we do Y. If A happens, we do B. And just to be ready, to have those teams trained and deployable and ready to go to respond to an incident. The way I talk sometimes, it makes it sound like an incident is a big thing. When I was working in financial services, I mean, incidents were the daily bread and butter of the job for several of our people. And so there'd be, 10, 20 of these a day that they would mark off, and just sometimes it's a very simple investigation. Sometimes a single incident can take several days to respond to. So it all depends, but you have to have those teams, and you have to have the preparation to be able to detect incidents and know what to do when one happens. Detection and analysis, that's simply, oh, a thing happened, what was the thing? And then containment is, this is a bad thing and we should stop it from getting worse. Eradication and recovery is the steps taken to remove the malware in the case of a malware incident, to restore data from backups in the case of malware that damages data, like ransomware. And then eradication and recovery can sometimes feed back into detection and analysis, because in that course of the process, you might find that it spread further than you initially realized. And so for those machines, for those accounts, the phase jumps back a couple of steps and you go back to containment. And then post-incident activity. After you've done all the actual cleanup, you review the incident. What have you learned? And how can you use that knowledge to protect the organization better going forward? Now, this diagram of the process is based on a very formalized workflow, NIST 800-61R2. It's a standard for how to do incident response. SANS also has a framework for incident response. There are a couple of other places that have published their ideas of a framework for incident response, but it pretty much all boils down to this process. And to simplify it even further, the incident response part, if you take away the preparation, if you take away the post-event analysis and lessons learned part, it's this. An alert happens, an analyst decides how bad is this, and then either escalates it to somebody else or resolves it. Now, we've got a couple of best practices. They're published pretty widely. That link will take you to a paper that has some great best practices laid out. Develop a plan in advance. This is the preparation stage. Your customers need to have incident response policies. Develop incident response procedures, and scope an incident before you start responding. So know your enemy before you try to take action. It's very tempting to jump in and go, oh, this machine's infected, I need to repair this right away before it gets worse. No, first you need to find out if it's already gotten worse. Acting too soon gives your adversary time to adapt, gives your adversary a heads up that you're aware, and might make them change their tactics in ways that makes your job difficult, more difficult than it needed to be. Touching or blocking adversary infrastructure is a great way to let them know you are on their tail and they are going to adapt. Complete all of your analysis before you take any steps. Don't block command and control until you're confident that you know all the command and controls. Remember VPN filter with its multiple command and control channels. You block PhotoBucket, the attack is going to automatically transition over to knowall.com, and your attacker is going to know that you're onto them. This is the pyramid of pain. It's not just modern art, it's not a game, it is a way of looking at incident response that was first mentioned by David J. Bianco, an incident response researcher, and you can see some quotes over there on the left. But the idea is that if you respond to the bottom things on this pyramid that are easiest for your attacker to change, you're going to have a harder time getting to the top things, which if you can block them, are difficult for the attacker to change. Now, this level of difficulty applies both to the attacker's ability to change what you see and what they are using, and also to the defender's ability to successfully block those things. You can block a hash by dragging it over to your block list in threat response. You can block an IP address in any firewall very easily. You can block domain names at Umbrella with a couple of clicks in threat response. Blocking network or host artifacts is a little bit more difficult, and it's a little bit more difficult to change those up. So if you can block that, you struck a significant blow to your attacker. But if your attacker knows in advance that they need to change their things around because they saw you blocking their hash values and IP addresses, they have got the jump. And we never want that to happen. There are different levels of maturity to an incident response process. And you'll often find that everybody is able to block these hash values and IP addresses. And obviously Cisco makes this even easier, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong, it's not a good thing. It's definitely a good thing. But these different levels of maturity can basically be scoped out like this. You have a nascent, a new incident response capability, which is ad hoc. An incident happens and somebody says, oh, we should stop our day jobs for a minute and deal with this incident, because there is no dedicated team. It's a part-time team that when there's an incident, somebody responds to it. It might not even be a team. It might be one person. Their procedures are going to be undocumented. They're going to have a vague idea of how they did it last time, and they might or might not try to do it the same way this time. But they know that there are incidents, and they know that they need to be responded to. So that's the most junior part on this ladder of incident response maturity. Then you have an emerging capability. You have at least one person who is full-time dedicated to responding to incidents. They have policies that are documented, and it's contextual, by which I mean not only do they understand the technology, but they understand the corporate risk model. They understand this technology is a higher value target than this other technology. They can identify key assets in the network. And then a leading incident response maturity level means that you have a specialized, highly trained staff. You have heavy usage of automation via API scripts written in-house or leveraged from other places. And the team is consulted. Consulted means they have a seat at security planning meetings. They are asked for their inputs when security decisions are being made outside of the incident response team. The firewall team will go to them and say, what do you think we should do about this, for example? So further up the maturity ladder is a thing called threat hunting. Threat hunting is the process, like it says, of proactively and iteratively searching through environments to detect and isolate advanced threats that evade existing security solutions. I put this here because threat hunting is not just incident response. The phrase threat hunting is overused a fair amount. This is my personal soapbox. Threat hunting actually has a meaning, and that meaning is hunting threats, not just responding to known threats, but hunting new threats. Threat hunting is not incident response. It's a way of finding incidents. It's an entry point into the incident response process. So they're very heavily related, but they're not necessarily the same. So when you hear threat hunting, just be aware that it might not actually be a threat hunt. And when you use the term threat hunting, please do try to use it properly because your customers expect it to be used properly. But what are the goals of threat hunting? And it's to answer a question, am I compromised? Do I have threats already in my environment that aren't being shown to me by my existing security technologies? So you're looking for evidence that would indicate the presence of adversary activities in your network, inside your perimeter, on the endpoint, or in systems for which you are responsible. And if you find them, you assess your security tools and find out, where do we have a gap? Do I need to configure something differently? Do I need to acquire another piece of technology? Do I need to deploy this differently? Is my network architecture wrong? And then also to reduce the dwell on exposure time. There have been multiple studies that tell you about how long attackers typically inside a customer network before they are detected in cases of these advanced threats. And you want to make it not 9 months. If it's going to happen anyways, and it will eventually, you want to make it more like 9 hours. Maybe that would be a good improvement. And if you have multiple detection methods that are deployed in an automated fashion, you have a much higher chance of reducing that exposure time. So what are the primary goals, what are the primary challenges of incident response? We're going to go through a little exercise here where we talk about our average incident responder, our hypothetical incident responder. And their main concern is, how did this happen to us? And what more do I need to know? So we're talking about somebody who's got about 9 years of experience. They've worked in the SOC. Maybe they've worked in the data center. Maybe they've worked help desk. And they get handed security events for investigation. So they need to be able to find the proper security data about that event, both global threat intelligence and local context, and find out what happened. Why did this happen? When did it happen? What can we do to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future? And what can we do to fix the damage because it happened now? So their goals are to monitor the network and gather artifacts for events without causing additional harm, without causing additional network outages, to reconstruct an event by correlating what they found out from all these different sources, to have a good working mental model of what exactly happened here, and to modify procedures and employ remediation strategies, like I said, to fix the damage and prevent future events of this nature. The challenges are they have all these different information sources, all these different tool sets that they have to consult and use. The ability to accurately trace evidence across all of these different technologies. Do the timestamps match up? Do all of my different things call this attack the same thing? I'll skip to the end for a minute. They don't. Everything has a different name for each possible thing that could happen. They need to thoroughly understand chaotic and erratic activity. And they need to be able to communicate what happened to non-technical audiences, including their direct superiors, in some cases crafting messages that will eventually be shared with shareholders, worst case scenario. So multiple different kinds of non-technical audiences need to have this explained to them. This is not somebody who handles the plumbing of security. This is not somebody who handles, making rules for the firewall on a regular basis, although they might in the course of an incident. In a more junior environment, they might actually also be that person, but it's a different skill set. In a mature environment, they will definitely not be that person. This is a guy whose full-time day job, typically in a moderate or advanced environment, is going to be responding to incidents, and there may be several of these in an environment. I've worked in places where there were always at least half a dozen of these guys on staff all the time, 24/7. They're generally reactive. Every incident response is by definition reactive because it's a response, but also involves some of that forward-looking thinking after the emergency is over. What did we learn that we can apply in the future to prevent this from happening again? But those recommendations are often then passed to other teams to actually implement. All right, so here's our guy. We'll call him Joe, just out of habit. Joe is an incident responder, and Joe will get a piece of information about which he's going to have questions. Here's a file hash. Okay, well, what happened? What was the method used to get this into our environment? What is the target of this malware? And how do I fix it? How can I repair the damage that is done? And like I've been saying, how can I prevent this damage from happening again? And we have all these different tools that we can use. So I'm going to ask this question about this file to my source of threat intelligence. And he's going to come back to me with an answer. It's going to say, hey, this file hash, yeah, I know that this is bad. Now, it used to be that you might only have one source of threat intelligence, but now, on average, responders have half a dozen threat intelligence sources that they correspond with on a daily basis. You can see them, some examples of them listed there on the left. And they're all going to have different verdicts because, like security technologies themselves, they have different viewpoints into the threat landscape. They have different angles. They have different technologies deployed to gather this intelligence. So they're going to have different results. And even when they have the same results, they might have it for different reasons. But now our incident responder knows that there's a potential threat, and they can take all that information and try to manually correlate it and cross-reference it and find out the details about that potential threat. And then we need to find out, did this potential threat affect us? And we have internal monitoring for that. And of course, everybody knows we're going to have multiple sources of internal monitoring, probably more than half a dozen. And each one of those is either going to have seen it or not have seen it. And we have to construct our mental model appropriately. So we've got server logs, we've got flow data, firewall, proxy, web application logs, IDS logs, more kinds of logs I'm not even going to get into that Joe can check to see, did this affect us in any way? So now Joe has the global threat intelligence, Joe has the local threat context. What is Joe going to do about it? Joe's going to draft a response policy. And that response policy is then going to be implemented in his organization's single and unified policy and enforcement tool. That's ridiculous. Of course, there are multiple planes of control across the network, and Joe has to make the appropriate rules to put into each one of those. But not only are those, single separate point in time things, but you have to consider how many different teams need to be brought together, how many different pieces of technology, can these all be done in similar time frames? Should we order the way, should we make an order for these responses? Should we do some before others? Do we need to do some at certain layers but then do them entirely differently, even using the same technology if those technologies are deployed at different layers of our network? And how will all of these changes work together? How will one response action affect the efficacy of some of our other response actions? If we block out at the perimeter, are we going to lose the ability to track a similar threat if it makes it into our network, and so on? So a summary of the challenges faced. We have limited resources. You've got a shortage of experienced incident responders and analysts. I can pretty much guarantee this because there's an industry-wide shortage. Even with all the training that's now available, there's still just a shortage of these skilled workers in the market. And our senior analysts are always pressured to be more efficient because their time is the most highly valued of all, and that's where the greatest shortages are. And so we need to be able to make our customers, more senior guys, more and more efficient, just like we do with their junior staff. We have to prioritize the alerts. As a customer, we have to prioritize the alerts that we're getting because we have limited resources and we can't reply to everything at the same speed. Sometimes we don't respond to everything at all. There's actually been studies done that show the majority of alerts that technologies like ours generate are just ignored. They never even, our incident response teams never get down to the level of, how big is this fire, that every alert is handled. There's always something less important than what needs to be worked on right now. And so this flood of alert, time is spent just in the triage phase. The ability to prioritize what should we investigate takes time. And it's often difficult to identify the source of the threat from the context that's available when you're looking at the high-level information in an alert, and that's part of being able to triage it effectively. Another challenge is effective threat intelligence use. TIP stands for Threat Intelligence Platform. There's also TIMP, which is Threat Intelligence Management Platform, two acronyms for the same thing. That is an entire market that has arisen because it's difficult to use threat intelligence well. I've set up threat intelligence capabilities at 2 financial services companies now, and I can tell you our customers are not ready to do this. I can guarantee you that in the vast majority of cases. They don't know how to operationalize threat intelligence. They may spend millions of dollars over the course of several years purchasing it, and in some cases, I've seen that they bought the threat intelligence feed from a couple of different vendors just so they could say they had done that. And the data comes into the environment and gets immediately ignored and just drops on the floor. The threat intelligence that they're using is often reliable and out of date, and they don't know what to do with it. I once designed a threat feed that would publish 100,000 IP addresses per day with information about why each one of them was likely to be malicious that day. And then I got huge customer complaints because customers were loading all 100,000 IP addresses as individual rules into their firewalls, which of course immediately died. So we need to do a better job in many cases of hand-holding our customers because one of their biggest challenges is what do we do with all this great information to which we now have access. So the last category of challenges there is that internet-wide threat visibility, the ability to connect in your mental model. How is this domain related to this IP and this piece of malware? Sometimes it's honestly very easy because the malware reaches out to a domain and there you go, but you don't always have that obvious link for two things that might be inextricably intertwined. And well, one of our examples actually touches on this really well. So with those challenges in mind, how can we make our IR teams more effective? These are the technologies we are going to talk about in our examples today. Now, this is a limited menu out of the entirety of the Cisco security portfolio. And it's just what's covered in this presentation. Cisco has many other security tools that could and would be of use in an incident response. Our NGFWs, ICE, for example, a lot of our technologies would be useful at various points in an incident response. Nobody wants to be here listening to me talk all day, so we're just going to cover the products that are listed here in the menu. So, and for endpoints, we get deep endpoint level visibility and protection. ThreatGrid, file-centric threat intelligence and behaviors, this Wikipedia of malware to which we have access. Umbrella Investigate, adversary infrastructure knowledge. Cognitive intelligence, adversary TPPs, threat actor models, cross-layer analysis, machine learning, and threat response, combining all the pieces of information provided by products like the above for more streamlined processes and unified rapid response. So, what is this? This is AMP for endpoints. When I do this live, it's a quiz, but it's a really easy quiz because the names for most of them are up in the top left. This is AMP for endpoints, cloud-managed endpoint security, combining prevention, detection, and response in a single agent. Very, very powerful product that everyone on this call is well familiar with. But it provides also deep endpoint visibility, which in an incident response is incredibly useful. And it provides quick and easy remediation capabilities. Like I said, adding a file to a block list is not rocket science. And it's on the bottom of the pyramid of pain, but it's still very effective as part of an overall response strategy. All right, and what is this? This clearly is ThreatGrid. ThreatGrid is our global malware intelligence platform, that Wikipedia of malware that I was talking about. It gives us automated sample analysis. It's used via its APIs in multiple Cisco and third-party integrations. You've heard of AMP everywhere, and because AMP uses ThreatGrid, we have ThreatGrid everywhere. And AMP is only one of the several dozen things that uses ThreatGrid for back-end file analysis or for up-to-date threat intelligence. The entire user interface is based off of the API. So if you can do it in the UI, you can also do it over the API, which makes ThreatGrid a very flexible, very powerful product. Umbrella Investigate, DNS reputation and protection. You can deploy Umbrella as easily as changing your DNS servers, and it's done. Like AMP, it's cloud managed. ThreatGrid is cloud available. And you have custom domain blocking, the ability to add a domain to a block list immediately and have that domain not be reachable by anything protected by your Umbrella deployment. And it also contains detailed domain data and domain history. From Umbrella Investigate, you can often get some very good information about your adversary infrastructure and be able to map the relationships between the domains, the IPs that may be hosting them, the ASNs to which those IPs belong. Powerful tool. This is Cognitive. Cognitive will automatically uncover CNC communications lurking in your environment. It goes through web proxy logs, applies some machine learning models, and detects patterns that are indicative of malicious activity. It provides prioritized and context-rich alerts. We have an example where we'll show a bit more detail about a cognitive alert. It tells our incident responder a lot of information that's of assistance in the triage phase before they even get into the investigation phase. And it is also a highly integrated product. It's used in AMP for endpoints, it's used in ThreatGrid, it's used in StealthWatch, the list goes on. And then finally, we have here Threat Response, the newest member of this list. And Threat Response brings you module-driven integration to orchestrate threat research and response. It gives you this intuitive relationship graph that you saw behind the text. It's built based on event telemetry from the modules. Threat Response is a module-driven architecture for every technology that is integrated into Threat Response. There is a module that handles the API for that technology. Threat Response is an API aggregator. We deal with all the product's APIs so that you don't have to, so that your customers don't have to. And we present this very intuitive diagram and streamlined UI, which allows you to make response actions in the technologies that are available without having to actually go to those technologies. And in fact, with the release of the browser plugins for Chrome and Firefox, you can now make those changes without even going to Threat Response directly from your browser. So, bit of a cheat sheet here. If you need deep endpoint visibility, if your customer needs deep endpoint visibility at any point in their incident response, which they will, needs to be able to see executions of files, needs to be able to see the relationships between processes and other processes and files and network resources, needs to be able to see the command line arguments that were provided in an attack on the endpoint, you need AMP for endpoints. If you need to be able to prioritize unique threat detections with some investigative context, you need Cognitive. If you need detailed, deep information about file characteristics, about what a piece of malware actually would have done on a target, you need ThreatGrid. For detailed domain data and history, Umbrella Investigate. To make custom file block lists, AMP. To make custom domain block lists, Umbrella. And for fast correlation of multiple data sets and quick response actions across multiple tools, your customer needs Threat Response. So now we're going to get into some scenarios. And before we make this jump at the 45-minute mark, I'm just going to check into my QMs check, is there anything in the QA channel that needs to be addressed verbally at this time? It looks clear to me. Okay, excellent.
There's one question, Ben, about in CTR, what's the glue that, what is the glue for data in CTR? SHA, timestamp, or both?
I'm going to say all of the above, and yet really none of the above, because the CTR is not a data repository. Now, there are some minor exceptions to that. Obviously, CTR stores the data while you're doing the investigation and looking at it, but CTR reaches out to all these different sources to get data, and any observable can be thought of as the glue. I mean, if we're talking about a set of domains that all, we're providing or making available for download a known malicious hash, then in that example, the hash would be the glue, because the hash is the thing that caused all the domains to show up in the same investigation. You might have it like, everything is the glue to each other, man. I don't know how else to say that. The IP, like every observable is an ID of sorts. So your IP address, yes, IP addresses can change, but if you have the same IP address hosting multiple domains, then you're going to see all those domains with literal lines linking them in a relationship graph to that IP. If you have multiple known malicious files or even known benign files that have been observed on an endpoint, they're all going to have lines going to that endpoint in that example, in that part of the graph. I guess the endpoint would be the glue. Adrian, am I even answering the right question? Am I on target here? You can unmute yourself, or you can post in the QA.
I think we're okay.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Adrian. Okay, so going through some incident response scenarios now. The first one that we're going to do is Olympic Destroyer. Now, the main characteristics of this response are that it's an on-the-spot thing, it's very time-sensitive, and it's reputation-sensitive. And what I mean by that, and this is a real concern for your customers, is that, somebody in a position of authority bursts into your office and says, tell me everything you know about this thing that I just heard of right now. And you're on the spot. As the incident responder, as the security operations center technician, you are on the spot. And how quickly you can answer and how deep and thorough your answer is going to affect your professional reputation. And of course, if this is an incident that could have public-facing consequences, it can also affect the reputation of your organization. And I mentioned earlier, crafting statements that are eventually going to be read by shareholders. You do not want to be in that position. Our customers do not want to be in that position. So there's the organizational goals of your customers. There's also the individual goals of the specific people to whom you are speaking. Nobody wants to be the manager of a SOC who made the wrong technology choice, or whose team deployed a technology incorrectly, and therefore, as a result, there was a huge incident that they have to explain to their boss and their boss's boss and shareholders and customers alike. Reputation is a huge part of security. And in this case, I put it in, it always is, but in this case, I put it in because of the personal aspect. The boss storms into the room and says, hey, what do you know about this random thing? And you have to be able to answer quickly in order to protect your reputation as a security professional. So here's the actual description of the scenario. Your CIO reads a front page news article about something called Olympic Destroyer, which was used to disrupt the Olympic Games. The news article suggests that other threat actors may be able to reuse this malware now that it's out, and that the malware is going to become just commodity and commonplace. The CIO is asking if our security products are already blocking this, or do we need to update? Do we need to do something else to be protected against this? What's your answer? And he's standing there waiting for you. And so you need to find out some things really quickly. You need to be able to find out if we were hit. So how are you going to find out if we were hit? Well, you can look for files. But what files are you going to look for? You can look for evidence of the malware's activity. What evidence are you going to even look for? Maybe network communications, maybe dropped file hashes. Where are you going to look for this information? You have to know. Okay, so you can go to your endpoint logs, you can go to your network logs, you can go to your email and web gateways to see if that hash has traversed those points. So starting at the beginning, looking for files. What files? Your boss didn't storm into the room with a list of hashes for you to examine. It was a headline, something you saw on Twitter. So where are we going to find these files? Well, okay, let's be honest. Google is a good start. Search engines are generally the first step of an investigation. So let's find, a blog from a known trusted source, Talos. Talos has a blog about this. So we're going to read the Talos blog article about Olympic Destroyer. And from here, we're going to get the malware details. And yes, we get the file hashes. Now we have the list of file hashes. Now, what are we going to do with them? Before we run off and start blocking file hashes, like I've said a couple times we don't want to do right away, the post also describes how does the malware work. So the malware is going to read LSAS for clear text passwords. It's going to scrape any open browser tabs for passwords. It's going to destroy backups by disabling the Windows volume shadow copies. So now we start to put together this mental map that I spoke of earlier of how does this piece of malware work. So there's the initial delivery, which drops the malware. The malware takes certain actions. It'll disable the VSC. It'll steal passwords out of LSASS and out of browser tabs. It'll use those stolen passwords to move laterally and spread throughout the network, and it will execute secondary and tertiary malware stages. How can we detect evidence of each of these different activities happening? Okay, so the initial delivery, it got into our network, so maybe we can find out how by looking at our network, email, and web indicators of compromise, looking for those things in our security technologies that protect those layers. It disables the volume shadow copy. Maybe we can see that with some behavior IOCs. We can see exactly what that looks like by running the malware in a sandbox. We can also use those same technologies to detect perhaps the stealing of passwords and lateral movements. And when it downloads and executes more malware, well, that's going to be detectable in the same ways that the initial delivery is detectable, by looking for the hash indicator of compromise at our network, email, and web security gateways. So now we have a bit of a mental model finally developing. And so we have, again, those same questions for our analysts. How bad is this? We now have some information about that. What does it look like? We now have some information about that. Were we hit? We now have some things to look for in our logs that we could check to see if we were hit. So the sample has IOCs that relate to PsExec. And this is a tool that's used for launching processes on the target or on a remote target. This is a clue as to how the lateral movement is done. How the lateral movement is done. And so the analyst has to start keeping track of the questions that they have about this incident response. Did the sample make it into my enterprise? That's obvious. Was I hit? What version of the malware was it that came in? Often malware will behave differently depending on which version of the malware it is, just like legitimate software. This stuff is developed and released over time. Did it spread on that host? Is there going to be backups, essentially, of the infection? And did it move laterally? Is it infecting other systems, other networks within my organization? So how to know if we were hit? Where do I look for this? Endpoint logs, network logs, email and web gateways. You can check all of these with AMP, because we have AMP for endpoints. Via the AMP-enabled NGFWs, we have AMP for networks, which will grab file hashes off the wire. And we have email and web gateways that are AMP-enabled, which will grab email attachments and web downloads. And we can even check all of this via threat response, because in AMP, if you have AMP Unity configured as a customer, if your customer has AMP Unity configured in their AMP for endpoints, they get information from all these sources in the AMP for endpoints console. And if it's available in the AMP for endpoints console, it's available over the AMP for endpoints API. And of course, if it's available over the API, then it is available to threat response. And the threat response AMP for endpoints module can grab that information and display it in the in the threat response user interface. So use what you got. Use the information you have. The first pivot point to the Olympic Destroyer is the hash-based indicator of compromise. This is just one of many options. I've walked you through the mental map of how the malware operates and shown you the different indicators of different types that can be used to detect different stages. Your customers are going to be able to know that there's more than just the hash involved. Malware can change hashes. Polymorphic malware is not a new thing. That's a reason that there are billions and billions and billions of hashes in the AMP file reputation database. But in this example, we are talking about the hash. So here we drop the hash into threat response. We see that it's been seen locally. We have a target icon. That purple thing means that we were hit. Not only do we know that we were hit, but we know that AMP detected that hit. It doesn't mean that we were infected necessarily, but it means we were targeted. That endpoint saw that file hash in some way. Then we see on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you see the wonderful relations graph that shows you those arrows I was talking about. So we see here, the hash in red in the middle is the glue for the constellation of events that include the clean file that dropped it, the file path and the file name that the file had on the file system at the time, and the endpoint that saw that file hash. And on the right, we see the histogram of the sightings history in my environment. where we see when the malware hits and to what extent, how many endpoints. We see that it was seen twice. And this is a slide, not the live thing, so I can't click on sightings and tell you what it was, but 2 of those 3 sightings were in my environment. And we see the judgments, 56 judgments in this case. I'm going to guess most of them from VirusTotal, and the one top-line judgment from AmpFile Reputation, which already knows about this thing and knows that it is malicious. So we saw the hash. I mentioned that that does not mean that we were infected, but what actually happened? Well, now that we're on the Sightings tab, you can see that we have a detection from the AMP for Endpoints module, and we have, on the bottom right of this is the AMP event, and you can click on that AMP event and pivot out into AMP for more information. So there's our Sightings tab, and there's the pivot that I'm talking about. And here you go to the device trajectory in AMP for Endpoints, and right there, circled or squared, highlighted in red, is the fact the file was successfully quarantined. So there you go. One quick Google search, grab the hash, drop it into threat response, and then pivot out to AMP, and we have the answers to the first 2 parts of the questions. Were we impacted, and how? We were impacted in that we were targeted by the malware, but the file was successfully quarantined. Our existing security solutions did protect us from this threat. Boss, we should renew AMP when our subscription is up. This is a very superficial example, just to demonstrate some of the first processes and to do a little bit of a deep dive into the incident responder thinking. Remember, this session isn't all about the technology, but we're using the technology to demonstrate what are common incident response concerns and challenges. So in this case, Boss barged in and said, hey, give me information now. And we help our customers grab that information quickly and allow them to answer those questions on very time-sensitive and sometimes emotional incidents that happen in their SOC. Moving on to scenario 2. This one's about PowerShell. How do attackers play dirty tricks with legitimate operating system components? How are we going to find out this question? We don't even have an incident right now. We're just wondering. This sounds more like a threat hunt. Folks, this is a legitimate threat hunt. This is what a threat hunt looks like. We don't have an alert to which we're responding. We have a hypothesis. The first part of a threat hunt, in any of the formalized documentations of the chain of events of threat hunting, the workflow for threat hunting, the first thing is actually called the hypothesis. We have an idea. This is a thing that might have happened on my network. How would I even find out about that? And so we're going to try, in this scenario, to identify legitimate versus malicious uses of PowerShell. If we find one, then we have an incident to respond to. We're going to find the infection cause and understand the scope of the infection. So here's the scenario. The security team has this hypothesis. We're going to inspect the environment for suspicious uses of PowerShell. PowerShell is a legitimate OS component. It's everywhere in our environment. We can't just say, oh, I found a PowerShell. This is bad. No, every machine has PowerShell. But we also know that there are malicious uses of this powerful scripting language that comes with Windows. This makes it difficult to detect attacks that utilize PowerShell because it can look just like normal system activity. Commands executed by this tool are trusted. This is a Windows component. It's like saying, well, I don't want to use Notepad. Therefore, it's crucial to understand the difference between legitimate versus illegitimate use of this technology. So what are the challenges in this scenario? It's present in most environments. It's a legitimate Windows tool. The actions that carries it out are implicitly trusted by the operating system. How is it used in our environment? And this is where our incident responders need to have that specific environment knowledge that I was talking about earlier. This is why they need to be kept in the loop for the things that IT does, because IT might be using PowerShell all over the place to automate all kinds of common tasks. That's what it's for. And so if you look at all PowerShell usage, you're going to find a lot of hay and not a lot of needles. But you need to be able to sift through all of that PowerShell usage to be able to find evidence of the malicious usage for which you are looking. So this story starts, as many do, with a search in AMP for endpoints. And so our security operator just searches for PowerShell. Find some matching activity, pivots through some of that to find out that it's a compromise artifact in a compromise. It brought up a compromise. We know that dropping PowerShell was not the compromise because it was already there, but it was used somehow in the course of an attack that AMP recognized. And so we look at the compromise event types. We've got the indicators of compromise. We've got PowerShell downloading an executable. That's weird. Okay, so that's good. That's a thing that can be detected that has a higher probability of being malicious than just PowerShell by itself. And we've got Word opening a PowerShell script. That's also unusual and probably not okay. So now we have three specific events that we can, three events across two detections that we can investigate and find out more about what does malicious PowerShell usage look like. And as we drill down, we find out more and more interesting execution events that happen with PowerShell that probably shouldn't. And as we go through each of these existing incidents, existing cases, and these might all have been handled automatically by AMP, by the way. We're using these known recorded incidents as a source of information from which we collect evidence. Okay, so we can, from the AMP console, get some very human-readable, junior-level, understandable information about what PowerShell is, how it works, and what these IOCs actually mean. So on the bottom left there, you see that Cloud IOC Win30 or W32.winword.PowerShell means exactly what I said a minute ago. Microsoft Word launched PowerShell. It gives you some more information about where we've seen malicious usage of this in the wild. It tells us in this case it was detected via retrospective there on the bottom right, which means this was out and about in our environment for a little while. But then AMP came back 21 minutes later, it looks like, and detected it via a retrospective quarantine. And so we are safe, but this has taught us about how to look for malicious usage of PowerShell. This is how we can help our customers gather information, because in the course of protecting our customers, our products do log very well and retain this kind of information for them to use later for education. So what would our response actions be in this case? We're going to work on how do we contain the effects of an infection that may have targeted PowerShell. We're going to determine the full scope of the infections that we've got or the infections that we've had, and make decisions on how to prevent lateral movement, perhaps with ICE, network segmentation. We are going to do eradication and recovery. Remediation, resetting, and re-imaging, not a pleasant task. Nobody likes to lose their box and lose all the files that they had on it, then have to go through the restore process or anything else that's done. But it's often necessary to provide those reinfections. And mature incident response organizations will have a streamlined process to make that as painless as possible for their users. And then recovery. How are we going to monitor for reinfections of these things to prevent similar compromises from happening in future? And then the post-incident activities, where we feed back the learning into that preparation phase. We apply patches, we remove the security gaps that may have allowed for compromises, we update our policies to prevent similar things from happening in future. So our third incident example that we're going to walk through now is about prioritizing those alerts and finding out why are there so many of them. In this case, we're talking about the Powlix malware, and we need to understand the alert volume, find out the cause of this high volume of alerts, and then rectify the situation. So one day, you and your team log into AMP for Endpoints console in the morning, and there's 60 threat detected notices. Somehow the CSO finds out about this and demands to know, how did all these malicious files circumvent security, and what is the scope of this infection? Are we owned up from coast to coast, or is it just one box getting repeatedly infected? What is going on? And so we need to quickly determine patient zero. How was this first endpoint infected? And why are there so many alerts? Is this thing spreading wildly all of a sudden? And why can AMP see this infection and tell us about it, but not stop it? And so where do we begin? We look at the alerts. The alerts are the thing that we have. This is definitely an incident response, not a threat hunt of looking for one. We have an incident. Now we're just responding. What does the alert data tell us? Are there any clues in the alerts themselves? How do we validate the scope of the infection? How do we find out how widespread this infection is? And what is the risk? What is this infection likely to do? What was the malware doing on the endpoint? What specific actions was it taking? And how does this relate to our organization's risk model? What machine was it on, and how much of a priority does that land or remove from this incident? So let's look at AMP. Here is the device trajectory for the alerts that are being generated. And it's a single device, so we only have one infected machine here, but look at that chain of alerts. Just being the same file being alerted on over and over again. Why is this happening? And if you look at the alert, if you mouse over any of the alerts there, you get the pop-up that's shown in the bottom right. The file was not quarantined in red, in audit-only mode. Well, there's your problem, right? So looking at the device trajectory, what did we find out? The eye, the little eye over the alert icon indicates that it's in audit mode, and you'll get that on every alert in the chain when you're in audit mode. So if you look at this device trajectory again, you see every one of those red circles with a symbol, and it has the little eyeball. This means you are not blocking threats. You have configured AMP. The policy that this machine belongs to is only in audit mode. And so the large number of alerts is because of the repeated execution of this file, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, obviously, but now you can see you have a file name. You have a file name, you have a hash, you know it will only happen on one machine, you know it happened over and over again. You get the list of command line arguments. What is this thing doing? It's launching command prompts. It's taking or making network commands. We've added a user. We're changing perhaps network configurations. We're changing the rights and privileges assigned to this user. We're looking at our existing network connections. Why was only one endpoint impacted? Let's dump the hash, or since we're already in AMP, we can just pivot on the hash right in the UI, pivot into threat response, and find out everything that we know across all of our technologies about this file hash. And again, we get back only the one endpoint. So if we have other modules configured, if we have other instances of AMP for endpoints even configured, if we have Umbrella, we have ESAs in the future, NGFWs, for example, we've only seen this file hit this one endpoint. But we've got highlighted in blue there, we've got these two domains. Hashes can change. Polymorphic malware, multi-stage malware. The hash is the bottom of the pyramid of pain. Network artifacts are a couple of steps, one step, two steps above that. And so let's find out what we know about retdemos.com. And this starts us down the rabbit hole. From one thing to the next, we continue investigating. We know the hash of the malware. We know the endpoint that was impacted by this file. We know what commands the malware ran. We know what domains the malware contacted. We don't know, is there anything interesting about this domain? Were there any other attempts to contact these domains that may have been blocked by other technologies that were sparked by other file hashes, perhaps? So here's the domain, retdemos.com. Umbrella Investigate tells us that the IP address hosting retdemos.com is also hosting legit malware.xyz. Can you tell this is demo data? Have we seen any additional activity from this domain or from any from this URL or any URLs at either of those two domains? So let's look up legit malware.xyz in threat response. And yes, we've had two endpoints contact that domain or be contacted by that domain. So if they were targeted, why were they not infected? Back to device trajectory. So looking at each of these two endpoints, one was protected by the exploit prevention engine, highlighted in blue, the text of the exploit against Firefox was stopped in its tracks by AMP exploit prevention. And the other endpoint, it turns out, was briefly infected, but then it was detected via retrospection, and the file was quarantined. So at the bottom, there it says the file is quarantined in blue. The very last line in this screenshot is detected via retrospective quarantine. Now, why would different engines protect you against the same threat in the same organization? And the answer is that those endpoints might have belonged to different policies that have different engines enabled or disabled. There's differences in the timeline. There may have been differences in the way the same file hash was dropped by an exploit or opening email attachments or different delivery vectors. And then the response actions for something like this are basically to make sure that your endpoints are protected against any of the hashes that came up in the course of the investigation. We've got that already. You might want to add those domains to a block list. You might want to continue to make sure that there isn't additional lateral movement. A thing that cannot be written in stone is at what point is your response finished. So it depends on the value of the target. It depends on how the attack methodologies displayed line up with your company's business needs and deployed security technologies. I'm not going to be able to tell a customer this is the point at which you should draw the line and consider the incident responded to. But for the course of this slide deck, we're going to call it done and move to the next scenario. In this case, we have an information stealer, number 4 in our list. How can we detect command and control communications through WebLog telemetry analysis? A nice short title to describe this scenario. We're going to detect and analyze an ongoing breach. This is still happening while we investigate it. We have to assign it a priority, and we have to do this investigation and contain the threat. So here's the scenario. The security team gets a notification from AMP, and for endpoints specifically, about an incident that was reported by Cognitive. If you recall from our menu, Cognitive does machine learning-based analysis of web log data. The team is informed that an endpoint is infected by a threat because we've seen communication artifacts that belong to that threat, that identify that threat. So the threat is active now. It's been able to bypass all the other security mechanisms that we have deployed. And so it's your job to find out how did this happen and what is it that's happening. So the things we need to find out, what is the risk score of this incident? We can find that out quickly because this is Cognitive, but what is the potential impact? There's a whole science around measuring risk. A very detailed science involving some very fuzzy top-of-the-head numbers most of the time. And you need to be able to do that to prioritize your team's limited resources that we've talked about before. What kind of activity does it carry out on behalf of the adversary? What is the CNC that has been observed telling this malware to do? And how do we stop this bleeding in the most effective and efficient way? So where do we start here? Same question as always. What does the data tell us? Is this a threat campaign, or is this just a one-off threat? Is this a targeted attack, or is this commodity malware? What is the infection scope? What is the risk of this incident, as mentioned? What was the malware doing on the endpoint? So we start by gathering context that will help us prioritize. Okay. Here in the Cognitive interface, we see that we've got this behavior highlighted. If we click through to that behavior, oh, it's a 100% confidence and an 8 risk score. That's probably bad. It's affected one user in our organization, so it's not widespread. It's affected over 100 users and 50 other companies. So it's not targeted. It's not widespread enough to really be considered commodity necessarily, but it's not targeting us specifically. And all this occurrence has been noted by Cognitive in the last 20 hours. You can see that it's not literally the last 20 hours, but in this example, it was 20 hours ago. And that tells us that it's a fresh threat. And then we get more information. So we find out this is a DNS change or Trojan, which is capable of stealing user and system information. So if this machine is something that's known to have, high value intellectual property, this is a huge emergency. If it's not, if it's a system that's never going to have any privileged user accounts touch it, that's never going to have any high value information on it, it's still important, but it might not be the thing that's most on fire right now. And that's a shame that things like this do get dropped by our customers because they simply have bigger fires at the moment, but it happens all the time. In this case, this is an 8, and we're going to say that it's on a system that does merit further investigation immediately. So instead of just like wiping it and moving on to the next thing, we're going to do a more detailed incident response. This uses PowerShell, and it bypasses those PowerShell restrictions, so it can execute arbitrary commands on the infected device. So we've got all kinds of remote access capabilities now. We've got the ability for the attacker to decide dynamically on the fly what are they going to do with our machine. However, its CNC comms do use a specific user agent string, which we're able to identify. So we should check the name servers on the host to see if they were modified. And we get all this information from Cognitive. Your guy does not have to go Google all this up. It's right there for them in this very informative cognitive alert. And then you get the IP address, the internal IP of who has been doing the communication that cognitive detected. So let's see if we can decode the command and control, the C2 communications. So up top is what it looks like in the real world. sportnew.net/u/?, and the Q equals and this whole garbage parameter. This is not encrypted per se. This is just obfuscated. And so Cognitive allows you to de-obfuscate this and to break it down into the JSON format. You see, is admin true? And so now it's reporting back, hi, I'm admin on this box. I'm your infection, and I have root powers, essentially. And so that's not good. But this is a level of information that Cognitive is able to provide to the incident responder by taking the de-obfuscation steps to convert that top garbage into the bottom, somewhat human-readable information that you see before you. So now we're going to find out what file is it that's actually doing this communication. So from Cognitive, we pivot into AMP, right there, single click, bam, you're in AMP device trajectory. And we see outgoing connection from ch1.exe to this location, sportnew.net, and then you see again the garbage string. So now we are in AMP looking at the chain of events that led to this communication. Step back in time, scroll to the left, and find in the device trajectory what is the chain of file executions that started all of this. So here we see ch1.exe being executed at the far right of the upper graphic, being executed by mem1.exe, which you can see it made a network communication. That's what the little arrow icon means. And then you see that it was started off by cooltool.exe. What is cooltool.exe? Well, it's a thing that was downloaded in Chrome. Later, it contacted Firefox, but it was initially downloaded by Chrome. So we have, Chrome's of course legit, so we have a user using their web browser, downloaded something and said, it was called CoolTool. Well, that sounds cool. Tools are cool. I'm going to download this thing because I found it on the internet. Click OK, because that's what users do. And then we have an infection. But that's the chain of events that led to this. So now we have that mental model again. Here's what we know now. We have a data exfiltration Trojan that changes DNS settings. So if it's changed away from Umbrella, that machine no longer has Umbrella protection. We know the malicious domains that are used for command and control, sportnew.net. We know the alert priority. Cognitive called this an 8. This is a box that has some of our IP on it, or perhaps has users on it that have certain levels of network privileges. We know what are the offending files and processes, ch1, mam1, cooltool. We know that it was caused by human error because somebody downloaded cooltool because it was cool. And we know what endpoints are affected. We know there's only one of them. And we know how long the infection has been going on, the last 20 hours. So what are we going to do for response actions here? We're going to contain it. We're going to use cognitive and ICE automated actions. We're going to use custom blocks on the endpoint. We're going to prevent lateral movement, again, using ICE and network segmentation. We're going to do our eradication and recovery. We're going to use Windows group policies to automate some of these tasks of removing persistence, just totally blanked on the word. Artifacts of persistence are going to be removed automatically using Windows group policies and some other tools. We're going to reset and re-image if we need to. That text is the same. And we're going to recover and monitor for reinfections. And our post-incident activity can always be summarized as feedback what we learned into the preparation phase and apply our patches, remove security gaps, and update our policies. In this case, we might want to do some user education. All right, scenario number 5, adversary infrastructure. This is another threat hunt. We're going to be a proactive threat hunter here. We're going to hunt for network artifacts. We're going to uncover some adversary infrastructure from a single sample analysis report. We're going to map out their existing infrastructure. We're going to provide some proactive protection. So here's our scenario. We have a hypothesis. We're looking at a threat grid sample analysis. The file was blocked by an ESA due to the fact that this sample had a high threat score from threat grid of 95. So we were protected against this specific event. We're not responding to this incident. We're not responding to an alert to handle an incident. We're using an alert as research data to test our hypothesis and to further clarify it. So we're going to look deeply into the sample analysis and recover some additional details. What do we have in the sample analysis? Well, first we know that this sample reached out to a malicious domain with what looks like it might be a algorithmically generated domain name. Umbrella tells us that this domain is malicious. We see that it was reached out to a couple of times by this particular piece of malware. Okay, so we have this wonky-looking domain name, which may be DGA, which Umbrella calls malicious. What else can we find out about this domain? Well, we can click through to it in ThreatGrid, and it's going to show us that it's hosted at this IP address, which has been flagged a bunch of times by short signatures of various kinds, and it's been tagged with some additional short signature names as well. It's found to be hosting multiple other domains. What's interesting about these other domains is shown in red at the bottom left for anyone following along. We've got the same strange, perhaps machine-generated string of characters in front of multiple domain names. The third-level domain name is the same across all of these similar but still different second-level domain names. Let's search in ThreatGrid for just that string. The $% sign there, so we're searching for the string and then the dot to show that that's the full string of the subdomain that we're looking for, and the % is just a wildcard. If you put a star, ThreatGrid will change it to a %. It's just the database backend wildcard. And we get back in the last 30 days that we have seen that string in this list of domain names, of host names to the right. Very interesting. So we then look up the IP addresses that are hosting all of those domain names, and we look for top-level domains that are associated with those domain names. We find at those top-level domains another subdomain, the 7GIE string there. So from one indicator, from one sample analysis, we're able to expand out to all of the information that you see before you on the rest of the slide. 22 TLDs, or second-level domains. One more third-level domain. A whole total of 30 IP addresses, and we can block those, we can alert on those, we can take whatever action our organization's policies deem necessary, and we can do this with our existing tool set, of course. We can block those IP addresses in NGFW, we can block those second-level domains and subdomains in Umbrella. In summary, we had some key learning objectives at the beginning of this, and we're going to go over them now. At the end of the session, which is almost now, you should be able to understand what are the biggest challenges faced by incident responders. So we gave you some examples of those challenges up front, and then categorized those challenges, and then showed you specific examples of those challenges at work in the scenarios that followed. You should be able to understand what steps responders take to overcome each of those challenges. And we gave examples of those steps in each of the scenarios when the challenges came up. And you should, hopefully, this is a big one, be able to understand and explain how Cisco products can help incident responders overcome these common challenges. I guarantee you the challenges that were spoken about in this session are something that has happened in every SOC that has anybody that you've spoken to in the last 24 hours, like it's happened in the last 24 hours. I don't care when you spoke to them. This is the nature of the job. So what are some additional links and resources? Well, the products, hopefully you don't actually need this, but here are links to all of the products that we talked about so that you can get familiar with the UIs and be able to demonstrate them to your customers. Here is some additional resources. The ATS TME YouTube channel is at cs.co/ATS-YouTube. Large number of videos there for you to peruse about how to use these products, how they work in some cases, how to configure them in some cases. We've got the ATS University Employee Communities page at cs.co/ATS-University. This provides you with actual courseware, one-hour courses that will, there's video material, and it will walk you through how the products work, in some cases how they work together. In many cases, if you take these courses and pass the quiz at the end, you get provisioned with an account on the technology that is being demonstrated. The Sales Connect security section, if you need to know where that is, I can help you. But go there because we are updating this material all the time. I put a couple things up on Sales Connect just the other day. Actually, I updated something yesterday. We've got a new module matrix showing what licenses are required to activate the different modules currently available in Threat Response and what activities are granted to you, what capabilities you gain in Threat Response as a result of having those modules. So keep an eye on that section there. I do try to announce on the appropriate mailing lists. Our entire team tries to announce when new stuff goes up, but be sure to have that handy. Look into the threat hunting workshops. This is a great way to get your customers exposed to Threat Response and the rest of the integrated advanced threat solutions architecture. It's a way to get them sleeves rolled up, elbows deep, get their hands dirty in demo data, doing lab exercises and learning how all this stuff actually works and talks to each other in the real world. The last link on this page is an excellent blog article where we go through in more detail about the process of incident response. You need to do things. You're on mute. I could assign you folks any possible kind of task right now. Ha, ha, ha. So this is what you need to do. Introduce your customers to threat response. I am still brought into customer engagements to do demos of ThreatGrid or the AMP architecture, and the people to whom I'm speaking, the customers, have never heard of threat response. I cannot stress heavily enough that this is not okay. Make threat response one of the leading items in your conversations with customers. Everybody wants their stuff to work together. Everybody wants access, well, not everybody, but everybody at like moderate or above levels of maturity wants access to APIs that allow them to automate the most common tasks their SOC engages with, or to allow them to tie their tools in with the other tools and processes they already have going. Let them know that threat response does this integration and allows them to integrate further with stuff they've already done. Folks, when you show them that they can use AMP for Umbrella together, or sorry, AMP for Endpoints together with Umbrella, and coming soon together with ESA, and coming a little bit after that together with their next generation firewalls, that they can take response or immediate actions across all those platforms with a couple of clicks in the same interface, they will want to buy all of those things. Show them threat response. Also, follow the ATS TME YouTube channel because we're releasing new stuff all the time that explains the benefits of these tools in a format that you can easily share with your customers and potential customers. If you haven't yet, take the ATS University courses. I think we're up to ATS 105 now. So there's 5 or 6 of them available. Take them all. They're a very good investment of your time, and it'll help you to explain and sell the solutions more effectively. And follow up on those threat hunting workshops. If you've got a prospect that you think the deal would benefit from a threat hunting workshop, make sure to contact the appropriate people and see what you can do to get that set up. That's the end of this portion of the presentation. We're at the hour-and-a-half mark now. I want to thank you all for your attendance, and we're going to take a brief pause while I set up a little thing that we're going to do about the APIs that I've talked about. And also let's check our questions and see if there's anything that needs to be handled in the QA box.
Q&A box looks solid. Do we have anybody that wants to come off mute? Raise your hand and we can get you a live question.
All right, either I've done a really good job of explaining everything, or after 3 days of my voice, nobody wants to do anything about it. All right, well, if we're clear to go ahead. All right, APIs it is. This presentation that you're about to see was put together by another TME in our team, Jesse Munoz. Could I have the ball back? Somebody done took my ball. Okay, there we go. Thank you. This presentation was put together by another member of our ATS TME team, Jesse Munoz, but he's not available at the moment, and so I'm going to run through it for you. This is a high-level overview of APIs. Threat Response is an API aggregator that uses all of these other APIs for you and has an API of its own. All of our products have been moving towards being API-driven. ThreatGrid started off API-driven. ThreatGrid has always had an API that was core to its functionality. The AMP API is growing out. We're having APIs retrofitted into all of our products, all of our security products that didn't already have them. I shouldn't say all. By and large, across the board, most of them are getting APIs built. So we all talk about REST APIs. You've heard the term REST APIs. What does that actually mean? And it means that you can access the API over HTTP. Standard HTTP calls. You don't have to learn a new protocol. Old-style APIs were often a proprietary protocol over proprietary ports in many cases. You had to learn basically a tiny little programming language to be able to use them. That's kind of garbage. And so we talk about REST APIs and RESTful APIs, and that just means that it can be accessed by standard HTTP calls against URIs. So you tell it what you want it to do by a combination of the URI and the method that you use, the HTTP command that you use to enable it. So you might have an API call that's like users, just, http://someserver.com/API/users. And then depending on what parameters you feed it, $create, $delete, reset password. The parameters will tell the system what to do about it. But it's very human readable as you troubleshoot and create the scripts, and it can be done in a standard browser most of the time. So HTTP commands like get can be issued by the browser. Other things like other commands like patch or delete or post can't always be done in a browser, but there are some very good tools, like something called Postman, in fact, is an excellent tool to prototype these RESTful API communications. The return data structure is also important because, again, it's something that your users might have to parse out manually. It might be in a proprietary data format. Ours are in what's called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, and it's something that is easily transactable in any programming language. Any single programming language that's worth using will have JSON handlers of some kind. It's a common, well-documented, fairly simple data format. It has replaced XML by and large in the industry for network-transmitted data. It's built around a simple key-value structure. So you have the key, which is like the name of the thing, and then you have the value, which is the value of that variable. So you might have like car equals, car model equals Ford Bronco or whatever. That's terrible data design. You would have that in two separate keys, but you know what I mean. So you have this idea of, between the two of them, RESTful requests to a web-driven API, and then returning this JSON payload. And so you make the request, in this example, to the AMP API over HTTP, and then you get this response back that's formatted in JSON. And you see a truncated example of a JSON response at the bottom of this slide. So AMP for Endpoints has an API. It's documented at this incredibly secretive hidden location, api-docs.amp.cisco.com. You don't even have to log in, I don't think, to get here. And you get the entirety of the API documents available for you right there in the browser. Very powerful tool that allows you to automate, allows your customers to automate a lot of the things that they may be doing manually. We have scripts, I've seen scripts that allow you to automatically move machines from one policy to another based on certain criteria, that kind of thing. Retrieving information about infections, downloading a constant stream of the events that have been recorded across your entire AMP for Endpoints deployment, all possible over the API. Cisco Threat Response, I talk about how it's an API aggregator that in itself has an API. We have API documents available in the help. You do have to be logged in to see these. Of course, you can log in with the AMP for Endpoints account you already have, or ThreatGrid, or any of the other functional ways of logging into Cisco Threat Response. The documentation for the APIs is great in Cisco Threat Response as well. It's all generated by a tool called Swagger, which I'm not going to bore you with details about right now. But it means that the documentation is kept up to date at all times. We also have a link to the GitHub there, where you can see some scripts that were written that handle the Threat Response API, which I'll talk about more in a minute. The Threat Response API allows you to do things like check the reputation of observables. allows you to do things like deep research into those observables. You can do a quick reputation check. You can look up the relationships that are available for those observables. Again, if you can do it in the UI, you can do it in the API. We've got a collection of scripts at github.com/Cisco Security, just like that. Cisco engineers providing a wealth of pre-built tools. We've got a number of little scriptlets, so to speak, that handle tasks associated with using the Threat Response API, like here's a script that will get you an authentication token. Here's a script that will, upload an observable to check the reputation, and so on. We have those for ThreatGrid and AMP for endpoints as well at this location right here. So if you're interested in doing some automation, or if you want to be able to point customers who are thusly interested to a resource that's going to be of great use to them, grab this and bookmark it and have it handy. All right, some use cases for the AMP API. We have an incident management system, a SIEM, and it's generating alerts. And we want to be able to grab the event stream from AMP so that we can pipe it into our alert management SIEM. So we get back this JSON. We go get the event stream from the AMP API. We get back these JSON events, JSON formatted event data. And then we can use that API to, just like I said, move the endpoints into a triage group. So if we have a malicious event that hit an endpoint, the SIEM gets it, and then via orchestration or just our own custom scripts, we can then use the AMP API to move those endpoints into the triage group in AMP, which will change the policies that are applied to that machine, each one. You stack all these read and write functions together, you have an automated, effective workflow that just chugs along without your IR people having to take their time to do clicky tasky things like moving endpoints every time into a new group. Let's share some vulnerability data with our NG-IPS. So we're going to use AMP for endpoints and the FMC. We're going to do a GET request to AMP and say, tell me about the vulnerabilities that AMP knows about in my network. We then pump that information into the FMC to gain additional insight, so we can say at a glance, hey, these machines that have these vulnerabilities, have they perhaps seen exploits against those vulnerabilities? Have we seen exploits anywhere? It's going to help us triage what are we going to patch next. The things that we're vulnerable to that are being exploited the most in our environment should probably get patched first. We can gather events. So here's a script. I'm not going to walk you through it line by line, but here we have a function to make that GET request to the AMP API. It takes some inputs, packages up the REST HTTP API request, and then sends it off. And then we're going to define our API credentials and the query parameters. And then we're going to present the results to the user. So you make the request, you preload the request with the data that's specific to this thing right now that we're doing, and then you present that information back to the user. Here's a couple of threat response API use cases. We're going to automate some response actions. So we get, again, we get the event stream from threat response into alerts, into our SIEM that collects all of our alerts. And then when we see an alert with domains that matches certain other parameters, we're going to go back to threat response and tell it to block those domains. We just can have this constant stream of domains being blocked via Umbrella, via threat response, based on attacks that have been seen. Now, obviously, you do not want to block every domain that's ever seen in the course of an attack, back to that pyramid of pain thing, but in certain cases where certain thresholds are met, you might want to do that automatically just as a baseline response so that that part is taken care of. You might want to get some enrichment on an observable. You might have we'll call it a file hash, sure. And you want to find out more about the file hash. So you're going to make that request to threat response. You're going to get back the enrichment results, and that enrichment data can then be fed into your local threat intelligence database, your TIP, those management platforms that I spoke about earlier in this example, Splunk. An easy way to do bulk enrichment, every IP address that you have to deal with in the course of an investigation that is recorded in your organization's investigation management technology can be extracted from that technology, enriched, and then that data pumped back into your threat intelligence database for use by your investigation team. So loading and enriching threat intelligence into your customer intelligence store is a huge use case for the threat response API. The places that I have worked at that have been mature enough to have their own threat intelligence management platforms, or for which their internal teams made those things custom and bespoke in-house, this is what those were for. There's an entire market around providing technology that gathers the kind of data that you can get out of our APIs simply, cleanly, and easily. You can also use the Threat Response API to manage your existing casebooks and investigation snapshots. Christopher Vandermeed is a Cisco employee who at Cisco Live Barcelona demonstrated a very powerful script that takes Talos blog indicators, searches threat response for them to see if we've seen those indicators and what else the rest of the infrastructure knows about those indicators, and then based on certain criteria, we'll pop an alert into a WebEx Teams space that has all of the pertinent information. I have written a script that just looks up in threat response by file hash to see if threat response is aware of this file, and if it's not aware of this file, checks in threat grid over the threat grid API to see if threat grid has seen that file in the last 30 days, and if the answer is no, it submits the file. I could do this in bulk. I could do this from a cron job on a directory that collects files from my lab based on certain other criteria. Everything is automated. It's doing it right now while I talk to you. More about APIs, more information about these APIs is available at these locations. The DevNet, the security subsite of DevNet, has a lot about our security portfolio's APIs. The Cisco Security GitHub account that I spoke about a moment ago. The documentation in the console mentions the API. It's not on this list, but ThreatGrid has some excellent documentation recently refreshed about the ThreatGrid APIs as well. And then in the threat response in the UI, you have the API help. If you look on my YouTube channel, or if you look in the ATS YouTube channel, there's also a video about the API relevant resources that have been recently released. It covers some of this stuff in more detail and some additional resources as well. I'm not prepared enough to have it ready to paste to you right now, but if you look at our YouTube channel, you'll find it there. And that brings us to the end of my second and final presentation. Thank you all very much for your attendance and for your interest. I want to thank our host, and I want to thank our panelists, our excellent question managers. And let's have a look. QMs, is there anything in the questions that is outstanding and still needs to be addressed? It looks like you guys are on top of this. Thank you so much, all of you. Okay, if there's anything else that anybody wants to ask in these last few minutes, put your hand up to be unmuted or post it in the QA channel. We'll hold on for like 60 seconds. And if nobody has any concerns, I think we could give you a few minutes of your day back.
No, wait, Dan. So we plan to do some demonstrations of use cases.
Oh, excellent. Okay, Renee, okay. I see you there now. My apologies. I'm going to, let's see, can we get Renee the ball, please?
Yes, I have it already.
Okay, excellent. Yes, my apologies. Excellent. I want to see this. Good. I'm glad you spoke up.
So, any questions for Ben?
Everyone's had a minute now. I think you can carry on.
Okay. Okay, let's have a look at some practical use cases for APIs. We created this for Cisco Live Europe, just delivered last month. And we picked for this session now 2 use cases. One easy use case for leveraging APIs for, let's say, new application or customer built applications. We named it FileGate, and the idea for this use case was I actually got from customers. So customers sometimes have the need for, accepting files on an upload server, as an example. So sometimes customers do not want to get, as an example, applications for employment via email, but they create a web application where people can upload their applications in PDF formats or Word documents or something like that. So this creates essentially a risk because untrusted people are uploading potentially malicious files. And the customer actually asked me for that. If there's a possibility that they can leverage their StratGrid application, their StratGrid account they already owned for securing this environment. Another use case from a customer was a file sharing platform for schools. So there was a local government that was trying to build a file sharing platform for all the regional schools so that teachers and students are able to upload files to share them with others. And this was also a risk. So we, together with my teammate Valeria Stibanti, she already actually wrote the scripts associated to this use case. We created a simple web page, an upload page where a file can be uploaded, and the scripts are taking the files into a, let's say, temporary folder. The scripts do not deliver the file to the final destination. And we use the CTR API to query the file reputation of the file. If the file is marked clean in AMP, then we deliver to the final destination folder. If the file is marked malicious, then of course we quarantine the file, means we block the access for internal users so that they do not get infected. If the file is unknown, we submit the file to StratGrid and of course wait for the results. And according to the results, we act further on the file. Either we deliver the file to the destination folder or we move the file to the quarantine folder. So essentially pretty simple thing, but I think it demonstrates how powerful people may leverage APIs in our solutions to build their own security applications. So this is an example. I've delivered an email to someone, to Mr. Schultz, with a request to upload the job application document. This person then gets to the upload portal. He then is able to upload his application document. And for the user itself, everything is done now. On the application server, we copy the file to a temporary folder, and we have some log files we can use to monitor the process. So these are the scripts. The general log file shows this file was uploaded and is now processed further. So this was the first step. We do now do the file reputation check. The result for this file is unknown. So that means this file has then been uploaded to StratGrid, of course, using the API. It's been analyzed now. And as soon as we get the results, the file is further processed according to the results. Okay, so and based on the results, we further process the file. As far as I remember, this file has been marked malicious. Yeah, exactly. So we got a search score of 100. The scripts are pulling the results from StratGrid afterwards. So there, once a minute, the script is polling ThreadGrid for the results. And just a second, we leverage this as a ThreadGrid demonstration as well. So, and looking at the log files, we see the file has been uploaded to ThreadGrid for analysis. And if we look at the content of the different folders, so we have the quarantine file folder, a clean file folder, malicious file folder, and this file now has been moved to the malicious files folder. Quite easy thing. This can be easily demonstrated to customers, and it's a good way to, let's say, increase the usage of ThreadGrid. Essentially, it's been using the API, and as all of you know, API submissions have to be licensed. They consume from the licensed file analysis budget of customers. So this may increase usage of ThreadGrid. The next thing, Ben already mentioned it, is a kind of cross-architecture integration. So we thought it might be interesting to create instantaneous collaboration between analysts and between analysts and users, essentially. So we have seen this already. So the incident responder has to answer a lot of questions as soon as he gets a new incident in. And he has to look at external threat intelligence, internal threat intelligence, things like that. And he's using the products they've purchased from us or from other vendors to get this visibility. So usually the incident responder gets an incident, gets an alert, an event, and reacts on it. But these events are created by the users, right? But the users are usually in the incident response process. They're completely outside of this process. And we thought it might be interesting to have this communication as well on the easiest possible way. So we created the idea of having a bot in the middle that's it's a good idea to leverage technology that's also in our portfolio, WebEx Teams. It's a collaboration tool, and it also leverages APIs or provides APIs. So the only thing we need to do is we have to create a bot in the middle that's able to subscribe to the event stream, that can take events, maybe filtered or with different, response actions there from the different sources. And with this use case, we integrated a bot into the AMP for Endpoints event stream. This bot then can take the information, can enrich the information based on what it's been able to fetch from CTR, from ThreadGrid, from other information sources, and then use WebEx Teams to consolidate this information and instantaneously push this information to the incident responder. And in addition, create a communication channel between the analyst and the users so that they can work together to get this issue solved. One note here, we've created this bot in the middle with the help of our partner Wipros. So they delivered already based on other technologies like IoT technologies, such kind of bots. And we just took the idea to leverage WebEx Teams for a security use case. So what I have here is I'm running the bot on my Mac here. So this is what you see running the bot locally here. This bot is subscribed to an event stream on M4 endpoints. And here I have my WebEx session or my WebEx Teams window. And as soon as I create an incident, like downloading a malicious file on a host that's been equipped with the M4 endpoint connector. So this session seems to be timed out. So let me start another one. Just a second. Okay. Here we are. So now I'm downloading a potentially malicious file, and we see the event comes into the bot. It is further processed. Information has been extracted from the event, and information is fetched from CTR and other information sources. The bot itself is then creating for me, as the incident responder, 2 new rooms. One is the room that's been built together with the user. So the user gets an information. The user gets first instructions, let's say not to power off the PC, not to disconnect the PC from the network, so that the analyst is able to do its investigation and maybe get additional information from the endpoint, like debugging, like fetching files, things like that. So this is to really proactively get in contact with the user and keep him involved in the incident response process. Then we have another room that's intended to be used for the SOC team, essentially. So this team is then, invited to that room, and additional information is posted directly into the room so that the analyst can immediately start. So the analyst can type here, so one person can take the call and then work on it so that other people in the team may leave the room to work on other incidents. And the analyst immediately gets the information about what was the detection name, what was the file name, disposition, severity, also information about the user, and we can get additional information, let's say, from an Active Directory as an example, like phone numbers, role, things like that. And we get information about the host, and the host will give us information. The host information give us indications about whether the endpoint is on-premise or off-premise, what is its current external and internal IP address. I can use the MAC address to point to an ISE installation as an example, to do a network-based remediation. So this is just a dummy URL that's been behind that MAC address, but it can be further developed to include these kind of integrations as well. And then we get more details. We can directly jump into the file trajectory here. From here, you all know this, we can directly jump into an endpoint search to see which other endpoints are affected by this. Do we have file analysis activities on this file as well? And what other endpoints are affected. We may jump into ThreatGrid to search for the sample or to search for the file as an artifact. We may have a look in Umbrella for this file to see which domains are in relationship to this file hash. I think you all have seen these kind of demonstrations before during the week and last week. And we can look at third-party information like VirusTotal. So let's see what VirusTotal says to this file hash. And this gives us, let's say, a final indication about, okay, maybe, so this is obviously really an ICAR file. This is not something that has kind of obfuscated by and then trying to take ICAR as being, you know, obfuscating its activities. Now it seems that this hash is really an ICAR test file. That's what VirusTotal and all the other vendors are saying. And this gives me, as an analyst, the indication to, again, talk to the user itself, ask him what did he do, why did he download an ICAR test file, and to do further, you know, collaboration with the user, and finally, you know, close this case and provide this information to the user so that he can, you know, do his daily job again. So we're planning, together with our partner, WorldForce, we're planning to further develop this use case to be able to maybe in the future provide this for organizations that do, let's say, managed endpoint detection and remediation services for our customers, maybe as a paid service that's been delivered by WorldForce, so that partners can purchase this service that's been hosted by WorldForce. So this is definitely, we got a lot of feedback for this integration, about this integration. And this is definitely interesting to speed up the incident response process, to make the analyst more effective, and to essentially save time to get an organization into a safe state more quicker and with less resources. So that was it from my side. Any questions? Do we have any question in the Q&A?
No, not seeing any in the Q&A, and don't see any hands raised at the moment. So there's a question that just came through. Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead, Renee. I'm sorry.
How can you still receive events from, so Georgi is asking me, how can the bot receive events from AMP? So what we leveraged is essentially the event stream capability on the AMP for Endpoint API. This was introduced with, I think, the latest update on the APIs. This gives us the possibility to create an event stream for, you know, dedicated event categories and events. Then the script is simply subscribing to that created event stream, and it's getting via an established connection to the AMP cloud these events streamed through that tunnel. So this is not something like the old API was like I had to pull, you know, every minute or every 5 minutes the new events, and the event stream is much more much better, fitting these kind of bot-like applications. We leverage the event stream also for various integrations. Let's say, as an example, the Splunk app is also using event streams, and other applications are using this as well. Okay, I think if there are no other questions, then this sums up today's session, right?
Yes, thank you both, Dan. Renee, appreciate the time spent. I think we've seen some great quality content over these last 2 weeks. And so I want to thank everybody that was able to either stick with us over the course of 2 weeks or had to drop in and move out, because I know that the time spent could potentially hinder doing business. So we've recorded every session. Many of the sessions have already been uploaded to the Box folder under the AMP and Threat Grid Assets. There's a folder called Training, and then Advanced Threat Deep Dives, and you'll see the virtual session there with the MP4s and links to the WebEx recordings if you don't want to download them and would rather stream. We'll send it out in email early next week once we've got the final couple of recordings posted. All the PowerPoint that we can post, we will also do and make it available there. Also, again, thanks to all the presenters, every panelist, the CSCs, TMEs, everybody that helped to make these sessions go. Our hosts, appreciate it. Have a great weekend, folks, and we will see you online, WebEx Teams, mailing list, somewhere. But if not any of those places, hope to see some of you at the SEVT. Thank you, folks.